Hello, this is Jordan and Sam back with another episode of the Cinema Scoop podcast. And today we're going to be talking about my favorite director of all time. I never thought I would say that, but it's David Lynch. I think just to set the scene a little bit, it was probably like a year ago. I started becoming like a film girly and like really starting to actively understand certain directors' bodies of work and knowing that like certain directors have different styles of work. And I kind of was peripherally aware of David Lynch in terms of like I had seen Mulholland Drive and had hated it with Sam. I think we'd tried to watch it like two different times and just deplorable hated it. And I think at some point I just was like interested to like what the fuck was going on with all of that? Like what is going on here? And why do people like this man so much? That like I kind of like I hate to say I hate watched all of his content, but like I sort of just like deep dived over the past year into his body of work because it's not that big. He has a lot of short films and like over 50 short films, I think, but like really only like 10 feature films. And then I found myself falling madly in love with everything he makes, for better or worse.
Yeah, I had seen a few of his before you went into your little deep dive this past year. And to be honest, I didn't really care for the few movies of his that I watched. But since you went into liking him so much, I revisited some of the ones from earlier and we'll talk about them. But I kind of like them a little bit more. There's still a few that I don't really care for or have problems with. Um, but I've seen all of them except one, which we will talk about. But we're gonna go through Jordan's full ranked list one by one, and we'll talk about each movie. And like you said, he has a ton of short films that you can do a completely different episode on, or you could talk for a long time about just the Twin Peaks of it all.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, Twin Peaks in and of itself could be multiple podcast episodes just because of the vast body of content that there is there. Um, the short films could be their own podcast. But I say that I'll preface everything by saying David Lynch is my favorite director, but I don't love everything that he puts out. Like, particularly his short films. I actually don't really like a majority of his short films because they're quite like weird. And I don't mean weird in like a dismissive way. I mean weird in um like a navel gazing type of way. Like they just don't really say as much as like some of his feature films do. Like I get it if you're going to be like esoteric on the timeline and be like I'm going to make a Mulholland Drive that's like over 2 hours and is like completely nonsensical and it's up to the audience to figure out what this means, but like try doing that in like a 3-minute thing that's like stop motion and makes no sense. It just feels a little bit vapid and meaningless. So anyway, I to sum all that up, I love most of his movies, but we're gonna start the list with my least favorite David Lynch movie, and I think we share this as our worst Lynch movie. And it's Dune. Dune is pretty widely understood as like even David Lynch's least favorite thing he's ever made. I think what's the name of like when you redact your name off of like the I don't remember what it's called. There's like a specific name. I'll insert a clip or something here later of what it is, but Jordan from the future. It is a pseudonym and it is Alan Smithy. You're welcome.
yeah, it's like a special Directors Guild legal thing they can do if the director has kind of disowned this movie. But yeah, basically David Lynch made two feature films. which we'll talk about shortly. And then he kind of had the option to direct Return of the Jedi or something else. And he had a meeting with George Lucas, and he basically said that all the Star Wars lore and stuff was too much over his head, and he basically had a panic attack and had to say no. Which is funny because then when he decides to do Dune, it's like for anyone who loves Star Wars for the lore, like Dune is like way more harder to get
Convoluted.
into. Like think Game of Thrones, but in space, but even more difficult to pronounce like plant like people's names and things that happen. But yeah, he notoriously has hated the production and how everything came about, and it was a big flop. And it's so funny that there's now the remade Dune with Denis Villeneuve and Zendaya and Timmy C. So
Yeah, it's really funny that this was like the precursor to all of that. It is genuinely such a bad movie, and I plan to never see it again. I think some people like it for the aspects that work. Like, you can definitely tell that there was like an angle that he was trying to take by doing this, but it just never pans out. Also, I've read and I've heard that this was not like one thing about David Lynch that I love is that he is like a true auteur, which just means he wants to have complete creative control over the end to end of a production. Dune is a great example of when he did not have complete creative control and it just spirals out of control because it's hard to work with somebody who wants to have complete control over the production of something and like allow collaboration and partnerships when like that's really not the best way in which they operate. Like David Lynch just does a lot better of a job when he's just left to do his own thing, which is funny because I would argue the complete opposite for George Lucas. You do not need to be left to do your own thing. You need people telling you, no, George, no, versus like, I feel like with David, it's like when he's left to do his own thing and he sort of just is like the owner of the vision of a project, it just works better. But overall, I think like he did not like the end result and like the post production of like how the movie went. There's a lot of like really cheap stuff in this movie when like I don't think this was like a cheap movie to make. But this is like just such a long and boring movie. I hate to say that. With Love and Kindness, it is a really bad movie. I'm pretty sure I like was just nodding off when we watched it. I was like, get me through this.
yeah, the budget was 40 million, which for 1984 is pretty big, and it only made 30 something million, so it definitely bombed. The very basic info about Dune, the story I kind of have gathered, but I'm pretty sure it's basically 5 books or something like that. It's
Mhm.
multiple books. So the David Lynch's Dune, I think, tries to do the first 2 or 3, whereas the newer Dunes, it's kind of like each movie's a book, I think.
Yeah. It's like I think he tried to cram too much into one
Yeah,
movie
which was part of the problem.
and then they edited down a ton and like it just didn't work. So, moving on. Number 9. I think we also share this as our second least favorite. I think I can appreciate this movie, but it is definitely not an easy rewatch. It is not a fun time, but I respect it for what it does for David's career. And it's his first movie, Eraserhead. I, what can you really say about Eraserhead? Like it's just a really fucking weird movie, man. Like I don't know. I just remember I was starting to try to get into David Lynch and Sam was like, "I've seen Dune and I've seen Eraserhead and I can tell you that I really don't want to rewatch Eraserhead, but Jordan, if you want to rewatch it, if you want to see it for the first time, I will rewatch it with you." But it's pretty gross and there's like a lot of body horror and a lot of just like surrealist vignettes that just like don't make any sense thrown in throughout the entire movie and like it's extremely off-putting. Can confirm. Very off-putting. A lot of body horror, a lot of like just uh gross stuff happening. Um but I actually have like researched a little bit more about it to understand like why is this the thing that like shot David Lynch to stardom? Like, why was this the thing that got him noticed in a way? Um, and like basically, if you know anything about David Lynch's life, this was his first like real feature film. And it's sort of like a horror story about what it's like to become a parent when you're not ready to become a parent. Ironically, like I watched this right after having Grace, and it's funny because like Parenthood is not as bad as this movie makes it out to be, but like I definitely think that there are aspects of the movie that do shed light on like the terror of becoming a parent the first time. Like it's pretty realistic as far as that like impending doom of like assimilating with another person's family and how that can feel horrific in ways. And like there's actually a lot of like really funny moments in the movie. Um if you're willing to like kind of look beyond the grossness of it. There's like a particular scene um where he's like at dinner with her family and like they're trying to cut up a chicken, but the chicken just starts like bleeding all over the plate and stuff. It's a lot of stuff like that, very Ari Aster, very like what the fuck is going on right now? Um but yeah, essentially it's just Jack Nance, who becomes like a mainstay actor in David Lynch's court, um, is gets this girl pregnant, and then she has a baby, or I say baby like in quotations because it's really there's even a scene in the movie where they're like, we're not even sure if it's a baby is what they say about about when the mom is trying to tell Jack Nance that his girlfriend has had a baby. Like they're like, we're not even sure if it is a baby. It spoiler, it's like a worm, and it's basically what happens throughout the movie is just like Jack Nance is left to take care of this like worm. And the worm keeps like annoying him and like whining and crying and has to have um like a humidifier and keeps getting sick all of the time. And it's just sort of like Jack Nance's like descent into madness and like wanting escapism past being like the sole provider for a child. I understand why like a lot of people really like this movie though, because there's not a lot of movies that are like really willing to go there in terms of like talking about the horrors of parenthood. I don't personally feel this way, but like I think from what I understand about David Lynch's life, this is sort of his inner world and like interpretation of what it was like for him and being terrified of becoming a parent. And also David Lynch is like a multiple times divorced guy, and so I think for him it was like he wasn't even really sure if he wanted to be with the mother of his child at that point. And so it's like feeling pressured and locked down to like create and hold a family all set in the backdrop of like Philadelphia, which I think he hated living there because the crime rate was really bad. And so yeah, this is just sort of like his surrealist interpretation of like a horror version of becoming a parent.
Yeah, it's definitely a unique movie, but it's one of those where it's similar. I felt it was very similar to his next movie after that. We'll talk about The Elephant Man, but
Mm.
yeah, it's not something I want to revisit.
Yeah, it's really not one that like I would like to revisit anytime soon because it's quite a hard watch. Like for black and white, for it being like a black and white movie, it's very gory. Um and just kind of like disturbing. But overall, I again I appreciate it for what it is. And I understand that like there was an interview where he like throws out this like one liner where he's like, "Did you know that Eraserhead is my most spiritual film?" And the interviewer was like, "Could you elaborate on that?" And he was like, "Nope, I'm not going to elaborate on that," which I think is funny. It's like, all right, okay, number 8. This one, Sam is the only one that Sam hasn't seen. I think I honestly should revisit this at some point. I think everything from here up on the list is like I would like to revisit it or I could revisit it. And it's David Lynch's G-rated Disney movie called The Straight Story. In true Lynch fashion, is off-putting, has very off-putting vibes through a lot of it. but is ultimately just the story of a man who, I think it's his brother, is dying, and his name's Alvin Straight, and he basically is trying to go get to his brother before he dies to like reunite with him, but he doesn't have a car and he's too old to drive a car, so he drives a tractor across state to go see his brother, and it's basically that's the story, is just Alvin Straight driving across, I think it's like upper middle plains America, to go see his brother. Um and like honestly, it's kind of a sleepy movie. I think a lot of people appreciate it because it's very beautiful in a lot of ways, and like there's a specific scene where it's like pouring rain and like thundering, and like the way that it's lit is gorgeous. And I think it probably has a good like message to it that's quite different than maybe some other Lynch material, but ultimately it just didn't really hit for me. Again, I think I might need to revisit it because it just kind of lulled me to sleep a little bit.
Yeah, the fact that it's rated G and it's on Disney Plus is just so funny to me.
Yes, it's really funny. I also think it's like, in a way, people call it like the least David Lynch movie, but I actually think it's in some ways some of the best parts of David Lynch all summed up into a movie, because I have a note in my phone to maybe go over this at some point, but like one of the main reasons that I like David Lynch is that a lot of his stories are very humanistic, and like the stories are revolving around human nature and like the human condition and like what it's like to be a human, what it's like to have empathy and those types of things. And I feel like the straight story does a lot of that. It's just not shrouded in as much like chaos and darkness as like maybe the rest of his movies are. So yeah, again, I think I might revisit it at some point whenever Sam wants to see it, then we'll revisit it. But number 7, I think Sam likes this one a little bit more than I do, but this is on my list of movies that I would love to rewatch. It's just very long, and it's Inland Empire. And this was the last movie that David Lynch came out with, timeline wise, like the most recent feature film that he came out with. And I think it's '07. So it's been a while since David Lynch has come out. I'm sorry, it's '06. Um, and this is like nearly 3 hours. And it's regarded as like esoterica level impossible, like very, very difficult to wrap your brain around. It is pure chaos. It's the closest thing I can think to being like um nearly meaningless for like 3 hours. Like it actually feels very similar in my mind to Beau is Afraid in that way, where it's just like very nonlinear, very hard to wrap your brain around what's going on. But the ultimate like deliverable package by the end of it is stunning and does have a through line and does make a lot of sense. I know you like this one a lot more than I did.
Yeah, I felt like at its core, it's a character study of Laura Dern's actress character. But because obviously Laura Dern is an actress who's been in multiple David Lynch films, it kind of felt like accumulation of multiple decades of their working relationship into a script. And I think I actually like this one better than Mulholland Drive, which is probably crazy to some people, but I think like the actual way the story pans out in Inland Empire, I think the whole time, even though there's a lot of uh random tangents it goes into, like it's ultimately Laura Dern's character's like consciousness throughout the film and like what is going on with her.
Yeah,
And I just felt like the vibes of Inland Empire were more accessible on the first. I've only seen it once, so yeah, I would rewatch this before I rewatched Eraserhead and uh, a few other ones. But
yeah. I actually feel like this is one that deserves a rewatch pretty soon. Also, like another just two side notes about this movie that I really love this movie, by the way. It's just if I have to rank all of David Lynch's movies, this is just the next worst one for me. Like it only goes up from here. Two things. One, when David Lynch did the promotional like stuff for this movie, there was like a specific video you can find on YouTube where he just goes out on a street corner in Hollywood with a cow and a large like canvas sign that just says something along the lines of like, see Laura Dern in Inland Empire. And he's just sitting out there in a director's chair with a cow. And people went up and asked him, like, what are you doing? And he's like, I'm promoting my movie. Like just the most unhinged way of promoting your movie. But like, that's David Lynch for you. And then the second thing about this movie is that David Lynch has a short that you can find on YouTube called Rabbits that I'm quite fond of. It's like very quintessential David Lynch, weird vibes of being like, what the hell is happening right now? There's just a bunch of like anthropomorphic rabbits in a living room, all talking about some imminent danger, but won't talk about what the danger even is. Basically, Inland Empire absorbed rabbits as a short and cut and chopped it in such a way that it ended up being part of Inland Empire, the film. So, if you want to know if you might like Inland Empire, maybe go watch the 50-minute rabbits short that is on YouTube. I've watched it and I prefer Inland Empire to Rabbits for obvious reasons, but yeah, basically there's the rabbits are kind of like a big portion of the movie as well, and like their worlds collide with Laura Dern in a way. So yeah. All right. So number 6. This is the last one before we get into my very top 5. And it's The Elephant Man. This is the last David Lynch movie I finally saw to complete his filmography. And like you said, this is the one that came chronologically after he directed Eraserhead. And again, black and white. I think the interesting thing about this one is that this is probably the most accessible David Lynch movie. If you've never seen a David Lynch movie, this is probably the one to start with. It's the most like critically recognized. It got 8 Oscar nominations and single-handedly is responsible for establishing the makeup award at the Oscars. Because of how good the makeup was in this movie, they basically made that award for the following Oscars, which I think says something. And also to put it in perspective, this tied with Raging Bull at that year of the like 53rd Oscars or whatever for 8 Oscar nominations. And so yeah, I it's probably the most heartfelt besides the straight story. This is probably like the most heartfelt David Lynch movie. Ultimately for me, it's not very rewatchable because it's depressing as hell. Cuz like once you know what happens, you know what happens. But by all means, this is like David Lynch esoterica level easy to understand what's happening in the movie. Like there's a couple of scenes of like weird ambient noise and like strange editing that happens, but generally this is extremely easy to follow. Um yeah, I mean I cried like a baby watching it just cuz it's like so like heart-wrenching and gut-wrenching. I would also like to say too that like this is David Lynch's Edward Scissorhands. Like this is his version of being like we shouldn't be scared of people that are different and we should not malign them in a way that makes them feel like losers or animals or things like that. Like I think Tim Burton has often said that like Edward Scissorhands felt very autobiographical. I think in a lot of ways David Lynch probably put a lot of himself into The Elephant Man, being that he's also a weird guy director who just is gonna do weird movies. Similar to Tim Burton, but also very different.
Yeah, we just watched this one for the first time recently. Yeah, I think like what you said, it's very easy to follow if you haven't seen any of his movies. Because it's basically based off a store, I guess,
It's a
old,
real
yeah,
guy.
So, and Anthony Hopkins is really good.
John Hurt's really,
John
really good.
Hurt's the Oscar nominee for this movie, and he's really good with all the makeup and stuff. But I would say I had this one lower because I just felt like once you've seen it, it's kind of like, okay, I get it. There's not really intrinsical rewatchability, and there's not really a lot of. I mean, there's happy moments, but the kind of ultimate ending is kind of,
Quite sad.
yeah. So like a lot of his other movies, I feel like you want to rewatch it because there's so many things going on to nitpick and talk about and think about. But I feel like Elephant Man, it's kind of like, well, there's a man who has a condition, and that's the movie. And
Yeah. I Here's another thing I'd put in my notes that I think now is probably a good time to say. And this I think is the reason why I didn't ultimately like love, love, love The Elephant Man, but I still love it. Like I still think it's a great movie, is that like one of the main reasons I like David Lynch is that he's one of the best mystery directors, like mystery film directors. But the unique part about Lynch movies is that you can live inside of the space of the mystery without feeling like you need to solve the mystery. And like you can go off on your own and Google like what's the meaning of this thing in this movie that he made or what did this thing mean? But like the ultimate kind of David Lynch experience is just sit with it and be in the moment, and you don't need to solve it and figure it out. Just like live inside of the mystery because that's kind of how life is. Like, not everything needs to be figured out. And I think that's like a big reason why I love a lot of David Lynch movies, but ultimately why I didn't like love The Elephant Man more because there's not very much mystery to it. It kind of ends and you know exactly what happened through the whole movie, and it's very like final. Like it's just kind of like there's nothing to revisit and like pick apart. There's no thread to pull. It's just kind of like, wow, that was sad and that's it. Okay, number 5. We're in the top 5 now. This was my first David Lynch movie I ever saw, and I had to watch it at least 5 times to even begin to like appreciate it, I think, which is why it's my lowest out of my top 5, and it's Mulholland Drive. Um Many a times had I watched this with Sam, and we are like audibly through the majority of the movie going, "What the fuck is going on? Why is she doing that? What is this? Why is this happening right now? What does this even mean?" It's like it kind of feels like that part from the Tim Robinson sketch where the guy won't talk, but he's just miming all the different things. That's
yeah,
me watching this movie for the first like 3 times. It was just me yelling at the screen, "What are you doing? Where are you going?" Like none of it made sense to me. And then, like most people, I wound up on YouTube in the corners of the internet that's what the fuck is going on with Mulholland Drive? What is going on? What does this mean? Why do so many people love this movie and I don't? I feel left out of the like inside joke. I feel like something is happening here that I'm either too stupid to realize is happening or I'm just completely misinterpreting this movie somehow. So I just kept coming back to it over and over again because I wanted to know what exactly was going on. And I'm at the point now where I've seen it, I think 5 or maybe even 6 times. And I'm here to tell you that I still don't know what's happening. But I feel like I've changed as a person over the course of the time in which I first watched it to now, to where I no longer care. Like, I no longer feel like I need to know what's happening. It's ultimately up to the viewer to decide what they think is happening. Um, I still think that there's a lot of like through line to the movie that is told asynchronously and like it's not told in a linear fashion. And so, like, generally, some guidelines for the movie are that, like, a lot of the movie is set within a dream, but does not tell you when the dream ends and when the dream begins, and when real life ends and when real life begins. Like, it's not expressly clear when that is happening. Um, and again, there's a lot of like similar type of like dreamy vignettes that happen where it's just like characters that you'll never see again in the movie, but they just come out for a scene to say something very weird or random that feels like it's not contributing to the plot whatsoever. The issue is that when you get to the end of this movie, if you kind of threw all of those things to the wind and didn't care about all of these random scenes that came up with random characters, there is sort of a packaged like story at the end of this if you really are able to sit there and pick it apart. And I ended up sitting Sam down like a couple of months ago, and I was like, okay, here's everything I know about what's happening in this movie. Let me re-explain it to you. Let me show you some YouTube videos to explain what's happening here. And this is, I think, my personal interpretation as to what is going on in the movie. Um, and I think I can appreciate it when I've assigned my own meaning to it. I think that's what's made me like it more, is feeling like I have my own personal take on what's happening here. I also think like maybe I just was like a very naive movie watcher the first couple of times I saw this. Like I hadn't really seen anything weird at that point. And so I think it just like outraged me that I couldn't understand what was happening. And that's what really like made me dislike this so much at first. But I mean, in a nutshell, like the movie is basically a suicide note to Hollywood instead of a love letter to Hollywood. Like if La La Land is a love letter to Hollywood in movies, like this is the opposite. This is like the deep underbelly of like the toxicity of the system and why it's so terrible, and like how it can really rip people's lives apart trying to like reach stardom. And it just can't be understated how incredible Naomi Watts is in this movie. Like she is truly amazing in the role she plays here. Like, um, yeah, I don't know if I have much else to say about Mulholland Drive except that like most people regard this as David Lynch's like magnum opus in a way.
Yeah, this was, I think, the first one I ever saw, or one of the first ones, and I just really hated it. And I
Mm-hmm.
still don't really like it that much. I rewatched it a few times with you, and like you said, I watched YouTube videos. I got what every smart person has to say about it, and it's still not really that good to me. Like, if you're only going to watch any of these movies one time only, I would definitely say this is probably the last one to watch. Or,
It's hard. It's level impossible, right up there with
like I
Inland
said with the
Empire.
Elephant Man, like you watch the Elephant Man, you when the movie's over, you feel like you watched the Elephant Man. When you watch Mulholland Drive, when the movie's over, you feel like you watched something that makes zero sense, and it's purposely that way. So then you have to
Mm-hmm.
like retroactively go back and like put all the pieces together. And then once you put the pieces together, you still don't have the full explanation of what's going on. And then at the same time, movies are an audio video format. So, like, at the end of the day, you're watching something and you're listening to something. And no matter what the context of that is, if it's not comprehensible in the first time the viewer watches it, you're basically alienating every person who watches it the first time. Even if they still like it, or if they want to go back and rewatch it, or go back and investigate and do research about it, like that's one thing. But I just feel like some other movies we'll talk about in a minute do a much better job of,
Playing that game.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think like I think the older I get, the more that I'll like Mulholland Drive just for the fact that like it is a huge feat in cinema to achieve what this movie is doing. Like there's it's quite like Lynchian and it's like probably his most well-known work. And I know there's a lot of people who like really, really love this movie because it just clicks for them on the first watch. I'm just not one of those people. Maybe I'm not smart enough or something, but yeah, the other thing that I pointed out to Sam and I think is worth noting is that basically Mulholland Drive was going to be the pilot of a TV show. And when they showed this pilot to ABC because they had done Twin Peaks, they hated it and were like, we can't do this. We can't use this. This isn't going to work. And basically, within like a day, David Lynch had to come back and scrap the entire pilot to create a feature film to make any of the material like usable. And in true David Lynch fashion, he was able to like spin a yarn and make it so that it was a movie all within like 24 hours, had like his finalized vision for what was going to happen. But if you look at Mulholland Drive as like a mystery film that could have been a better pilot to a TV show where the mysteries of what's going on in this would later be revealed, but because it's a feature film, they just don't reveal them. I think then you can kind of see maybe the direction this was trying to go or what was happening here. So, number 4, you could argue that this could be split up between 3 different entries in this list. I am not going to do that because, again, we could do a whole episode, but I'm going to put Twin Peaks as at its entirety. So that's season 1, 2, The Return, which is season 3, and Fire Walk with Me. We're going to put that all as my number 4. Um, you've not seen any of the TV series, really. You've only seen Fire
I
Walk
saw
with
the
Me.
pilot,
You saw the
and then
pilot,
I've seen the Fire Walk with Me movie.
which I know is like sacrilegious if he hasn't seen the show, that I'm not supposed to show him Fire Walk with Me, but it I was having a bad day the day I wanted to see this and I was like, can we just get a cherry pie and like can we watch Fire Walk with Me? Which for anybody who's seen Fire Walk with Me, if you're having a bad day, maybe don't watch Fire Walk with Me because it's downright depressing. Um but yeah, like the idea is that you're supposed to see seasons 1 and 2, then you see Fire Walk with Me, which is a movie prequel to the TV show.
That's
Then
that's why I think it works, is because it's a different format, but because it's a prequel, that means you basically don't have to watch the show at all, and you can still watch the movie.
this is definitely not a prequel movie you should see before you see the show, though. I
But
say
I
that,
basically did,
but
and
he
it
basically
still
did.
worked.
It still worked, but I think it didn't land as like devastatingly hard for you as it could have. Seasons 1 and 2 of Twin Peaks are the most, well, seasons 1 really is like maybe the most like joyful, happy, comforting mystery show I've seen on television. Um, it's like such a comfort show for me at this point, and like the atmosphere of just being in the Pacific Northwest in this like made up town where there's like diners and there's like a tiny little police station. Everyone's kind of a caricature of real life. It feels very like what I would imagine like Archie comics kind of feel like. Um, and it's very like soapy in a lot of ways because it's supposed to be kind of like making fun of soap operas at the same time as being sort of like a murder mystery show. Um, season 1 is just like I again, it was one of those that like I watched part of it and I was like, "Oh man, I really don't know if I'm going to like this. This is just like not my taste." Um, and I just kept watching it and like kept putting it on as like comfort. And all of a sudden it just like reached inside my my chest cavity, grabbed my heart and was like, "You know what? Actually, this is maybe the most heartwarming show I've ever seen in my whole life." Um, it's a murder mystery show on the surface. Kyle MacLachlan plays Agent Dale Cooper and he's just like obsessed with coffee, and like that's his entire personality, is being like this most like wonderful happy-go-lucky FBI agent who just loves coffee and is like, arguably one could say his entire like life is fueled by black coffee. And like when he drinks more coffee, he sort of like regains more powers and is like able to solve mysteries better. um but like the stark contrast of going from seasons 1 and 2 being quite lighthearted. There are definitely like a lot of dark elements, especially when they like reveal who Laura's killer is. There's a lot of like supernatural elements that happen. There's a lot of dream sequences and things like that. Going from this to seeing the prequel movie Fire Walk with Me, it's rough. Like it's hard to go like hard pivot like that. And I see why a lot of like really big original Twin Peaks fans don't like Fire Walk with Me, but I also like just can't help but love Fire Walk with Me in a lot of ways, because if you haven't seen the show, I'm not going to give anything away, but I've like said this so many times when I'm like explaining Twin Peaks to people or trying to explain it to people, but like ultimately the show is supposed to make you feel like most mystery shows do, which is, who could it be? Who could have killed Laura Palmer? Could it be this person? Could it be her boyfriend? Could it be you know, the lover she has on the side? Could it be her friend? Could it be this town bad guy? Could it be the drug dealer? Could it be this? Like ultimately the show is supposed to represent kind of like the evils of like real life. And like when someone dies in like actual real life, it's always somebody that was closest to them, and it's never as glamorous as it is in like mystery shows. And I think like Fire Walk with Me does an incredible job of showing you, this is exactly how this happened and this is exactly how she died, and this is gross and terrible, but unfortunately this type of shit happens every day in the US, and it goes unnoticed, and nobody is there to help like a lot of girls who go through this, and it's really really sad. Like it's a really sad movie. um but also like the ending of Fire Walk with Me is just so beautiful. Like i I just love it. It feels like almost like spiritual in a very weird way. I don't know how to describe that, but yeah, to like kind of move on to talking about The Return, I'm not completely finished with The Return right now. I'm on episode 12 of 18, but I have spoiled it for myself because I don't trust myself to be smart enough to like understand what's happening. Basically, 1990 was when the original Twin Peaks TV show came out, and then Fire Walk with Me came a few years after that in the 90s. And then 25 years later, David Lynch gets a deal with Showtime to revive the show and come back for one last season, chronologically 25 years after the events of the original first two seasons. And I'm utterly blown away by how he has done what he's done with this show, because it might be the craziest TV show I've ever seen in my entire life. Like I really don't know how to explain it. So I'm not going to, because I just don't think I could accurately. But I'll say this, if you liked Nathan Fielder and Benny Safdie's The Curse, I feel like it is highly um reminiscent of the feeling and the vibe of Twin Peaks The Return in a lot of ways. Just very like surrealist, very dreamlike, very like supernatural elements, but also like a lot of dark humor. Um yeah, I really don't know how else to explain it, but this is like really what cemented my love of Kyle MacLachlan as an actor, because in the third season he's basically playing four different characters and that's like really hard to do all within one thing. But yeah, you surprisingly made it through Fire Walk with Me. I was very surprised that you were able to withstand that, having none of the foreground of like who the characters are, what's
I
going
mean,
on.
you kind of gave me a
Yeah,
rundown,
yeah,
so
yeah. I did kind of give you a rundown, a little bit of hand holding to get you through that one. But Yeah. So yeah, Twin Peaks in its entirety, I feel like is my number 4 on my list. Okay, we're gonna go through these last three semi fast because I've told Sam this before. My top three are in my mind all very equal, but they're all very different. And I have like my personal favorite, but number 2 and number 3 are somewhat interchangeable in favoritehood. So my number 3 is Wild at Heart, which I want to remind everyone is the most romantic David Lynch movie that he's ever made and is one of the most happy endings of a movie I've seen in a really long time. Like it just has the most like perfect ending. I really want to rewatch this soon. It's another Laura Dern, David Lynch collab. Jack Nance is in this one again. Harry Dean Stanton is in this one again. Harry Dean Stanton collabs with David Lynch a lot. Um, and Willem Dafoe is in this one, who does an incredible job of being the most disgusting character I've ever seen, maybe in a movie ever. Um,
And Nicolas Cage.
and Nicolas Cage is in this as like the most Nick Cage type of character ever. Um, Yeah, in interviews with David Lynch, he basically has described this movie as like he wanted to write a love story set in hell, and that's pretty accurate to like how the movie feels. It kind of just feels like the ultimate like it's like the ultimate but daddy I love him movie. Like it's kind of like two people are trying to like find their way out of hell together, but they're like madly in love and like nothing can stop them. And yeah, it honestly, there's like one of my favorite scenes in this entire movie. Someone tells Nick Cage some like quite devastating news, and he just immediately puts 2 cigarettes in his mouth and lights them both at the same time to like deal with the stress. And I just love that. I don't know. Yeah, this movie is like live fast, die young, fast cars, hot pink, flames, like it's so campy and like so wonderful. And it also like all of David Lynch's movies have a lot of like Wizard of Oz symbolism, but this is the one that has like the most overt Wizard of Oz symbolism. There's like the actual good witch Glinda is in this for a couple of scenes. um yeah, I just bought this on Blu-ray, so I need to actually see it like on a larger screen. um but it's definitely like tied for first place as one of my favorite David Lynch movies. It's also like really, really sexy too. It's just like hot, hot, hot. I can't believe I'm saying that about Nick Cage, but yeah.
Yeah, the next one is Lost Highway.
And this one I feel like we've only really seen this all the way through one time. And I'd say it's like medium difficulty level.
Yeah, there's like multiple um, timelines,
Mm-hmm.
and certain characters become different characters. But it's a lot easier to put together than something like Mulholland Drive. But there is like that added element of like trying to figure out what's going on. But I like Patricia Arquette. I like Bill Pullman with the saxophone. Um,
Yeah.
the
There's
David Bowie song.
This entire soundtrack is top notch. Like he literally worked with Trent Reznor and Nine Inch Nails to like create the soundtrack. And like, yeah, the opening song is a David Bowie song called I'm Deranged. And it's just this shot of like driving excessively fast down a road at night. And all you can see is the middle line, like the middle dotted line of the road. It's an iconic movie. It's one that like feels the most Fincher in a way. Like it feels the most like a David Fincher movie. Um, but it's also the closest thing to like maybe a horror movie that David Lynch has, I would say, in a lot of ways. There's like a lot of moments
There
of
is a lot of elements to it. Yeah.
there's like a couple of moments of actual like uncomfortable terror where you're like, "Oh my gosh, what's going to happen?" Like there's a specific scene where Bill Pullman is like walking down this hallway in his house and he's like retreating into this like dark corner of the hallway where it's not lit up. And it's so dark that you can't tell if something is going to come out of that dark corner. And apparently there was like feedback given to David Lynch that they should like fix that in post production. And he was like, no, I don't want to. It adds to like how scary it is. Like, why would I fix that? Um, but yeah, Patricia Arquette is so like amazing in this. She specifically took the role because she wanted to play like a very sexual character because she's not ever done something like that. Um, and she does just such an incredible job. And like her, I've heard her in interviews talk about how like respectful David Lynch was of her modesty and how she like would between takes would just be like, can I have a robe, like to not just like be naked in front of everyone, and that he held a very 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 tight closed set on scenes where she would have to be nude because he was extremely respectful of like her shyness and all of that kind of stuff, which I just think is, I love that David Lynch is for the girls. So yeah, we'll move on to the last one. We've already kind of talked about this one in my top 5 favorite movies of all time, but it's Blue Velvet. It's the one that I have frequented watching the most. I would say difficulty level medium, but it's really not difficult to like understand. It's pretty accessible in terms of like the storyline.
Yeah, there's a lot of symbolism, but the actual story is a singular timeline, so it's pretty easy to follow from scene to scene. And because it has that mystery element to it, I understand why it's your favorite for sure.
Yeah, it's the one that feels closest to like a Nancy Drew mystery. I mean, all David Lynch movies are kind of mysterious and mystery filled in a way, but this one feels the most like a suburban neo noir. Um, yeah, if you don't know the premise of the movie, it's basically Kyle MacLachlan's character is home from college because his dad has had a stroke. And while walking home from the hospital, he discovers a severed ear in the woods. And that's pretty much all you need to know. And that's what I love about this movie is it just gives you one tiny clue and then you like follow that clue and it just branches out from there into like discoveries. And it's like you can really trust Kyle MacLachlan's character as like the one you can see yourself in. Um, and I think like I've heard in interviews that like David Lynch has referred to Kyle MacLachlan as being like the sweetheart person that you can feel comfortable enough with as your main character in a movie to like trust them to like hold you while they go into like a very dark, scary place. And that's like so true about this movie. It's also like has an incredible soundtrack too. Definitely not as good as Lost Highway though. Lost Highway has the best soundtrack of any David Lynch movie. Um, if we aren't counting Twin Peaks: The Return, that has a very very good soundtrack that would rival Lost Highway in my opinion, but I would say this is a close second or third. Um, but yeah, I think it might always be my favorite David Lynch movie just because I don't know, it's like the ultimate detective story. It just feels like perfect in a way that's like indescribable. There's definitely like easy things to nitpick about the movie. The bird at the end is so incredibly fake looking. You know, Laura Dern when she cries has like this really 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 ugly cry type of face. There's a lot of like really silly parts to the movie, but in like a lot of ways it just feels like a classic in my mind. But yeah, that's kind of all
Great
of,
villain.
oh yeah, great villain. It yeah, I don't think that there's been a villain in movies that I've been more scared of than this villain. Like he is quite literally just the most like terrifying villain I've ever seen in a movie, to be honest. Um, but I like I don't know if I mentioned this on my favorites, but because Harry Dean Stanton had worked with David Lynch for a lot of other things prior to this, I guess he had seen that he could, like, he had read the script and was looking into the role of Frank Booth in this movie. And I guess he turned it down because he said that he didn't want to have those feelings, which I just think is funny because I'm so glad that Harry Dean Stanton didn't play this role because it would make me like feel so differently about him. Um, but yeah, I don't know if I have much else to say about Blue Velvet that I haven't already said, or I could literally just go on forever about the perfection that is this movie.
Yeah, I'll need to watch The Straight Story, and I want to rewatch Wild at Heart and Inland Empire soon. So I think that the overall filmography is definitely one of the more unique, interesting ones to talk about and go through. Unlike our Martin Scorsese episode where he has like 30 plus movies and we just want to talk about our top five, David Lynch has a smaller filmography and it's easier to just talk about each one, really.
Yeah, one of the like another big reason that I like David Lynch as the director and like just his body of work in general is that I keep comparing him to Ari Aster, but I think it's similar in that way. You made a comment about how Ari Aster just like lives on a completely different brainwave than the rest of humanity. There's a lot of me that likes weird movies because I respect people that are willing to do weird things and are willing to put their full chest into it and be like, yep, this is it. This is me. I'm doing something weird and you don't have to like it. And I don't know, there's like parts of me that just really love movies that are movies and filmmakers that are like willing to do stuff like that because it's like you're just creating without fear of rejection. Like you're really just creating like exactly how you see things and exactly how you would say something. I don't know if I have much else to say except that's it. That's all that's all I have to say about David Lynch. This won't be the last time we probably talk about him cuz you know me, any chance I can, I'm like, let me tell you another fun fact about a David Lynch movie, but um yeah,
Thanks for listening.
thanks for listening. We'll see you next time. Well, you'll hear us next time.